Welcome to today's Boss to Boss podcast. In our interviews, we feature great business people doing imaginative things in otherwise unimaginative markets, usually from the world of B2B. Today's interview is with a man who's been a driving force for change in a market famous for its caution and conservatism. In 2011, Robert Camp became managing partner of the law firm Stevens Scown, and in the years that followed, he not only doubled the firm's turnover, but picked up all sorts of accolades in the process, including 6 consecutive years on the Sunday Times list of best employers in the UK. In today's podcast, we're going to be talking with Robert about the changing nature of customer experience within professional services, the undervalued role of language, and why technology isn't always the key to transformation and growth. Robert, thanks for joining us. Where I'd like to begin is around the question of customer experience. So it seems to me, and I don't know if you would agree, that there seems to be an awful lot of chat now about customer experience. How much of this is simply empty talk versus genuinely making change?
Great question. I think change has been forced upon the profession, as we know through the pandemic and lockdown in many areas. I think, is it empty promises? I think no. I think it's more that firms are now aware of this and it's rising up the importance level and table. And I think it's people are much more aware that actual customer experience is key to driving growth as we come out of the pandemic. So yes, there's a lot of talk. Are people actually doing stuff that impacts that? That's a question that I think is right to ask. I think enlightened firms have really understood that the emotional roller coaster that everybody has been on over the last 9 months means that understanding the customer is so much more important than it was even just 12 months ago.
I wonder about the role of language in all of this, because increasingly within this conversation around customer experience, I notice a lot of companies, and from a brand perspective, I think this is fantastic, but they're talking a lot more about the use of tone, the use of language. How important is it for companies to really be quite prescriptive in this brand lexicon? Or is it enough for firms instead to simply establish a broad framework of values within which their people can operate? How specific, how prescriptive do you think firms should be from a language point of view?
Yeah, I think, professional service firms have historically had brand guidelines, which actually then turn much more prescriptive. So whilst their marketing teams would always refer to them as brand guidelines, they're actually pretty prescriptive. And a lot of that is due to the command and control nature of how professional service firms have been traditionally run. So everything goes through the center. I think brand guidelines are absolutely imperative, but they should just be guidelines. For me, the biggest thing that firms need to be doing coming out of the pandemic is telling stories. And unfortunately, professional service firms find telling stories difficult because actually what they want to do is they want to tell the facts. And they want to tell the facts in a way that they think is understandable and in a way that sells their expertise. But people are desperate for stories now. You only have to read the newspapers. Look at all of the TV ads from the big worldwide companies. They're all trying to tap into this emotional roller coaster that we've been on with stories. And for me, those firms that actually start telling stories that are genuine, how they've helped in their community, what their staff have been doing to support, the key workers, the health authorities, the nurses, the doctors, the shops, buying local, anything like that will resonate with potential customers. You've then got their interest already. I saw one great example. I think it was when we came out of the first lockdown, and I was looking on LinkedIn at what professional service firms were doing, read the announcement, and most of them were, oh, here's a link to the government website, here's our views and thoughts on the technical part of the release. And then I saw one accountancy firm had just put a list of our pubs open, green tick, our nightclubs open, red cross. So simple, so engaging. There wasn't anything about links or anything. So anybody would have seen that and immediately been able to understand it, and then would have followed up, of course, with an inquiry to that firm. So much better because it was in language that the potential customer understood.
I wonder, is that rule about telling stories rather than simply listing facts, features, benefits, is that pretty universally applicable? Or do you think that's more true targeting, maybe selling certain services to certain sectors? Is it more true for, let's say, those firms with more of a consumer market than perhaps those selling into a B2B audience? I just wonder to what degree those principles are universal or need to be kind of flexed in accordance with the audience in question.
Dan, great question. I think 12 months ago, I'd be definitely saying it was more B2C market where stories, but actually, as I say, you only have to look at what every corporate is doing at the moment is they are trying to ensure that their brand isn't tarnished by the way they dealt with the pandemic, be it the way they've treated staff, customers, their environment within which they work, because they understand that the customer is so much more attuned to the emotional aspect of buying. So I think they apply equally applicably to B2B and B2C. You may have to nuance how you actually tell the story, but it's still storytelling. We've helped. I'm just giving an example, not me personally, but you could have a story that we've helped a small independent brewery understand how they can use the furlough scheme, et cetera, to make sure that when we come out of pandemic, their pubs are still going to be open. It's things like that which will resonate not only with the B2C, but also the B2B.
To what degree do you think the typical leader of a professional service firm is equipped to drive these things, right? Because we're talking about essentially about, marketing here. We're talking about brand, an understanding of the customer journey. Now, the way that most traditional firms operate is the people at the helm tend to be at the helm because they're fantastic at the thing that the business does, be it, a law firm, accounts firm, whatever that might be, not necessarily because they're brilliant at telling stories. To what degree do when you look at the typical professional service firm, if there is such a thing, how well equipped do you think the person at the helm usually is for these responsibilities?
Actually, I think much better than we thought. And I think one thing that lockdown has shown professional service firms is that agile decision making is absolutely paramount to survival, both during lockdown and I believe post lockdown. I think what's historically happened is professional service firms' decision making has been very constrained, very risk averse, which plays into the natural professional tendencies of the individuals leading. But I've had some fantastic conversations with leaders of professional service firms over the last 6 to 9 months who have absolutely relished this freedom of decision making. And I think they are understanding, language, stories, customer experience, customer journey, and are quite liberated because they're not having to go through the usual consultative process of professional partnerships and or the cumbersome, well, we're only going to try this if we know it's going to work for certain. So I think it's actually released quite a lot of people to try stuff in this area, and they're actually enjoying it. So it's a chicken and egg, because I think you're right. Traditionally, that's what we have been, very traditional and not wanting to try new stuff and understand new stuff. But I think the lockdown in particular has given leaders the ability to actually really understand this in a much deeper way than prior to lockdown. You think of all the stuff that's out there on the net about customer experience, language, stories, which you can do in your own room. You don't have to go onto a very expensive conference in London, staying overnight. So I think there's real opportunities, and I've spoken, as I say, to a lot of people who are embracing this. Yes, there will still be the traditional firms who don't get it, but then there always has been, and those firms are going to not get the growth they need to come out of the pandemic in a secure, sustainable manner.
Again, a very general question to a nuanced problem, but for the majority of professional service sectors in the UK, how many years to survival do you project for those firms that fail to get with the program? As you say, there have always been firms that have done things in a very traditional way relative to that point in time. Do you think we've reached an inflection point where where their days might be up if they don't start to get with the program?
How many times have we had these conversations? Traditional professional service firms have been written off in a financial crash, the recession, doomsday of Brexit, now the pandemic, and they're actually incredibly resilient. I do think this is a bigger issue for them because I think the government assistance has actually protected inefficient firms. Once the repayments of the CBILS loans, the VAT, the income tax starts kicking in, I think badly run firms are going to struggle to have cash to keep going. There's an awful lot of consolidation going on, I know, in the legal sector with the big consolidators acquiring firms that couldn't get PI cover, are running out of cash. I think to answer your question, I think we'll see a real shake-up within professional service firms over the next 24 months, where there'll be a lot of consolidation rather than firms going bust, but the consolidation will be on the terms of the consolidator rather than the owners selling out to secure their financial future and pension.
Just going back to the question of storytelling, there's been an awful lot of focus over the last 10 years. Maybe certain professional service sectors have been slow to catch up. An awful lot of talk over the last 10 years, I would say, of the growing importance of being purpose driven, having a clear vision, etc. Sometimes I wonder, which might sound odd for someone in my kind of position to say, sometimes I wonder if we might overemphasize the importance of these things slightly and forget the value of just being bloody good at what we do. Do you think there's ever a danger of that? That sometimes we may get so caught up in the fluff, the kind of lofty, abstract vision statements, or as Simon Sinek might say, understanding your why rather than simply your what. That actually, we almost lose sight of the what, and sometimes we may need to get back to fundamentals, really nailing our core competencies as a professional service firm, whatever they may be.
Absolutely, Dan, absolutely. And I think where this conversation around purpose is interesting is I think there is a real genuine desire for the majority of business to embrace, for want of a better phrase, build back better. And there's a lot of commercial reasons for that, not least that the new entrants in the employment market are looking for purpose-led businesses. However, the trick is to make it genuine, and you've picked up on a very valid point. And as someone who led Stephen Scone through a very major cultural change, what lots of people don't understand and appreciate is it takes time and hard work and effort. It's not a very quick fix. It's not just banging on your website a purpose-driven statement. And if you're really going to embrace purpose-driven values, you can only do that if the business that you're running is brilliant at what it's meant to be doing. You can put a purpose-driven statement on the top of a badly run business, and you might get a small uptick, but you will not get sustained growth. You won't get sustained retention and people wanting to join you because they'll see through it. So it's making that purpose and that value of the business embedded and sustainable for the long term, which means, as you rightly say, you've got to be absolutely brilliant at the product or the service that you're delivering.
I want to talk about technology for a moment because, of course, when we talk about customer experience, customer journey, and when we talk about innovation, we very often, I think particularly around innovation, we often almost use the term interchangeably with technology. We assume that the one thing means the other. Whereas from my experience of working with truly innovative brands, technology tends to be just 10% of their transformation, and critically, it's the bit that comes last. I wonder what your views are on that idea, and is there a danger that firms may sometimes overestimate the role of technology and perhaps miss some of the more fundamental innovations around HR, product, and process?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And where firms fail to see the role of technology is they quite often put it at the beginning of the process, whereas actually the technology solution should be the enabler of what you're trying to achieve. And too often we put let's find a tech solution to a problem rather than actually understanding what the problem really is, designing the solution, which may mean completely non-tech processes and systems or whatever need to be looked at, and then saying, can we use tech to enable the solution that we've created? And I think a lot of that is down to the fact that we're not leaders of professional service firms, as you said earlier, are in those roles because they're very good at the job that they were trained to do. And so we employ IT directors and IT consultants, and a lot of the time we don't fully understand what they're saying. So we're happy to be led by and driven by the tech people. The problem with that is that a lot of tech, both the kit and the personnel driving tech, don't fully understand the people side of any solution. So it is so key for me that you look at any frustration that you're trying to resolve in the process with your customer. How can you innovate and improve that customer journey? You look at it completely holistically. And once you've really drilled down and identified what the problem is, then you say, well, could tech help us change this and improve it, rather than all too often, as I say, we just say, oh, what's the tech solution for this? I think tech is also an interesting one where, whilst I think stories are no longer necessarily segmented between B2C and B2B, the other trap that professional service firms fall into is they see tech as a one-size-fits-all. Whereas I believe what you need to do with tech is actually compartmentalize it much more. So, for example, if you've got quite a lot of owner-managed businesses, they're still going to want that personal connection with their professional service people, but they're going to want slick processes to back it up. If you're dealing with a government agency or a big PLC institution, and you're looking after shopping centres, say for land securities, they're much more going to be driven by just efficiencies and processes and systems, where tech will have a much higher role in delivery of the service. The trouble is we tend to lump everything together and don't understand that tech actually has a different role to play in different services, even though they may be under the same sort of heading, like audit or property law or whatever. But actually, again, it's understanding your customer. What does your customer actually want? And don't tell your customer that they're going to have the service provided this way if you haven't actually asked them if that's how they want it.
An example I often give with this is, so it was actually an interview I conducted probably 18 months ago or so, a company called Farewell. And what really struck me about Farewell, and as I say, this was a couple of years ago now, so I'm sure things have moved on, but at the time, Dan, the CEO, was very honest about the fact that the technology they were using, and at the time they were just totally dominating the wills market. They were writing, I believe, something like 1 in 20 wills in the UK. Their second closest competitor was the Co-op, writing 1 in 100, and the Co-op had about 10 times the number of personnel in that part of the business as Farewell did. And what really struck me about Farewell was that Dan said, fundamentally, the technology they were using was no different, really, or not really that much more advanced than the technology that a whole bunch of other companies in that space were using. It actually had very little to do with the technology. The innovation was all around, as we say, those other kind of fundamentals of running the business. But of course, then a company like that is so in control of those fundamentals and so in control, most importantly, of its data, it then means that when it does, add the technology on top of it all, they're in a fantastic place to leverage that. But it just really, really struck me as an example of how we can very often, particularly those people who understand technology the least, will almost not overestimate the importance of it, but perhaps the stage at which it needs to come into that sequence.
Yeah, Dan, I think that's absolutely critical, and it's a real issue that professional service firm boards and leaders have, is that if you're going to introduce a bit of tech for a specific process, historically professional service firms haven't dictated that that's the way it's going to be done, and every matter will be done like that. Every piece of that work will use this piece of tech. We allow our advisors, because they're very high intellect, high achievers, very professionally trained, we allow them too much latitude, which then destroys the efficiencies that you're looking to bring in by introducing that tech. So you're right. So where you've got a will process, every will has to be done by it. But you try introducing standardized will IT into most traditional law firms, and you'll have pages and pages of exceptions as to why it won't work for that particular matter. And that's because we like to have the tech dealing with 100% of the work we do, rather than saying, actually, if it does 90%, we can have an exception of the other 10%, but the 90% is all going to be done in the same way, because then you can drive the efficiencies. You can use the technology to really drive performance. If you say we're only going to have 50% and 50% opt out, it just doesn't work.
Presumably, this also demands then that the leader, again, has quite a reasonable grip of technology if they're to understand, so that you don't end up with this kind of siloed scenario where, one thing is being driven by the tech function, and maybe that everything's a little bit kind of, without them having really an intimate understanding of what's underneath that, and you end up with this very kind of disconnected structure. I just wonder, are we expecting too much of leaders? Because we talked earlier about how they need to understand brand and customer experience and vision and purpose, but we also now are saying that they need to be, pretty confident from a technology perspective, so they can understand at what stage that comes into play. Are we expecting too much of these people?
Yes. Yeah. And I think the key for me is, again, mid-tier professional service firms have historically undervalued management and leadership. And what they need to understand is that actually, if you get a very good business support team, and I mean at director level, you can leverage that cost immensely, rather than trying to get your managing partner or your partner-led board to try and deal with, as you say, brand, people, tech, finance, everything, which is traditionally how it's been done. You appoint your best lawyers, your best accountants, your best surveyors to run the business and expect them to carry on with quite a full caseload. Well, you're never going to get the growth that you want unless you appoint professional people into the business to run those teams. But it has to be at that such a senior level that they are part of the team, effectively the board determining and implementing the strategy. Where you get the silos is where firms say, oh, we can't afford a director level, so we get a manager level. But then the manager has no sort of status within the business, so the partners will just ignore whatever the manager says because they're not a senior enough level to have that credibility amongst the partnership. And I think it is, historically we have undervalued leadership and management, but the returns are immense if you invest in it, because it's not that expensive relatively. When you're looking for 10% growth, it pales into insignificance.
So, Robert, for any firm looking to really kind of begin this journey, then to start being able to tell powerful stories, powerful, purpose-driven vision statements that are authentic and people can buy into, where would you suggest they begin? How would you suggest they kick off that process?
Just one sort of easy takeout. If any firm or leaders are thinking, how do they embrace storytelling? The answer I always say is ask your staff for the stories, and ask them just to write it down how they would say it to a mate down the pub or in the coffee house. And you will have a treasure trove of stories that you can shape within your brand guidelines, and you can start to publish on social media. And I can guarantee the impact will be almost immediate. But you have to stick at it, because people see through brands that are shallow. But if you ask your people, tell me how you've helped somebody over the last 6 months, you'll get countless stories which you can shape and use.
Looking back over the last sort of 10, 15 years, I know you did remarkable work from a growth perspective with your firm, but I'm guessing it wasn't all smooth sailing. Would you be willing to share with us one mistake, one path you went down that maybe took you to the wrong destination, concerning these subjects of customer journey and telling these compelling stories, doing so in an authentic way? Was there one moment where it all went a little bit wrong, but perhaps taught you some really kind of big lessons in the process?
Yeah, I think it's internal comms was the area where I think we had the most sort of hiccups. And there's one great example is that our IT director, way back, this was way before most professional service firms were thinking about apps. He designed himself and actually got built with a third party app builder, the first external facing client app for law firms. And it was the first in the country. And it won quite a few awards. And I got it very wrong in selling it internally, in that I could just see what an amazing thing this was. The lawyers just were terrified of it. And I got it wrong, and we got it wrong in how we rolled it out, and they didn't embrace it. They didn't push it out to their clients. Eventually, some did, but it didn't have the impact that it should have had. And it was way before its time, and it should have been something that really set us apart as a business even more than we were in those days. And it could have been a massive impact on growth, even more growth. And I got it wrong internally because I thought they would see the benefits, but they just saw all the risks. And we didn't explain it, and we didn't communicate it properly, and it never succeeded as it should have succeeded.
Thanks so much, Robert. Enjoyed this a lot and really appreciate your time.